There are countries whose history flows like a calm river. And then there is India, a world unto itself, as old as the first cities of humankind and yet full of youthful energy. A mosaic of cultures, religions, and stories that has unfolded over thousands of years. Imagine a landscape where the sun rises over mighty rivers, where more than 4,000 years ago engineers planned streets in perfect lines and merchants carried precious gemstones across the seas long before Rome was even founded. But India's history is not only a chronicle of kings and wars. It is a fabric of philosophy and mathematics, of music and poetry, of spiritual searching and economic ambition. It has experienced golden ages in which knowledge and art inspired the world, and dark hours in which entire empires crumbled. It has welcomed visitors from afar, but also repelled invaders and reshaped its identity each time. Today we will embark on a journey that leads you from the mysterious cities on the Indus to the radiant palaces of the Mughal emperors, from silent temples in the south to the steaming ports of the colonial age, from Gandhi's quiet voice to India's place as a rising world power. It is a story that has just as much to do with us as with the people who lived it, because it tells how cultures arise, how they grow, how they stumble, and how they rise again. So stay with me, because in the very first part we will travel back to a time when there were no nations, no flags, and no borders, only a flourishing civilization on the bank of a mighty river, whose secrets have still not all been uncovered even today. When we take the first steps on this journey into the past, our path leads us to the banks of a mighty river that has given life for millennia, the Indus. Here, in a fertile plain between high mountains and desert, one of the earliest great civilizations of humanity emerged more than 4,000 years ago, the civilization we now know as the Indus Valley or Harappan civilization. Its cities, above all Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, were not the accidental work of generations, but the result of precise planning. Streets ran at right angles, houses were built from fired bricks, and a sophisticated drainage system carried wastewater away from the residential quarters, a technical masterpiece that in this form was not achieved even in ancient Rome until many centuries later. The people here practiced agriculture, cultivated wheat, barley, and cotton, kept cattle and water buffalo, and used the river as a lifeline for trade and transport. In finely crafted seals, pieces of jewelry, and ceramics, we see a society that possessed both practical ingenuity and a sense of aesthetics. Through trade routes that extended as far as distant Mesopotamia, they exchanged cotton textiles, beads, and gemstones for tin, wool, and oil. In this way, a network of exchange arose that connected the Indus with the great currents of the world. And yet much of what we know about this culture is a puzzle with missing pieces. Their script, engraved on small seals and clay tablets, remains undeciphered to this day, and so we can only guess what myths, laws, or songs may be hidden in it. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, we find no palaces or magnificent royal tombs, no stelae praising rulers. Perhaps their society was less hierarchical. Perhaps they organized themselves in a form that is still unknown to us. The end of this civilization remains another mystery. Archaeologists suspect that a combination of climate change, the drying up of river systems such as the Ghaggar Hakra, and possibly political or economic tensions initiated its decline. Compared with the violent upheavals of other civilizations, the disappearance of the Indus civilization seems almost silent. Its cities were abandoned, its streets left empty, its seals forgotten, and yet its legacy endured. Techniques of urban planning, agricultural methods, and perhaps even religious ideas may have lived on in later cultures of northern India. In a certain sense, the Harappan civilization was a quiet foundation stone for much of what still shapes the Indian subcontinent today. As we now emerge from the mist of prehistory, the next step leads us to a new wave of people who moved through the passes of the Northwest into these fertile plains. They brought their language, their gods, and their songs with them, and they laid the foundation for one of the most enduring cultural and religious traditions in the world. We now enter the age of the Vedas, in which myths, rituals, and a strict social structure shaped the identity of ancient India. When the great cities of the Harappan world had long since been abandoned, and the wind blew through their empty streets, new paths opened in the northwest. Through high mountain passes and across wide steppes, groups of people entered the subcontinent whom we now call the Indo-Aryans. They did not come as a single unified people, but as tribal groups who brought with them their language, their songs, and their ideas about the world. We do not find their traces carved in stone, but in verses passed down orally for generations. The Vedas, a collection of sacred texts that rank among the oldest in human history. These hymns, prayers, and philosophical reflections tell of a world in which gods rode across the sky in heavenly chariots, in which the sacrificial fire was seen as a gateway between humans and gods, and in which order and harmony had to be preserved through the proper ritual. They reflect not only belief, but also the everyday life of the time, from the battles of chariot warriors to the festivals on the banks of rivers. Sanskrit, the language in which these texts were composed, shaped not only religious language, but also became the foundation of numerous modern Indian languages and a carrier of highly complex philosophical ideas. With the Indo-Aryans, a new social order developed, one already hinted at in the Vedas, the Varna system. It divided society into four main groups: the Brahmins as guardians of knowledge and ritual, the Kshatriyas as warriors and rulers, the Vaishyas as merchants and craftsmen, and the Shudras as servants and agricultural laborers. This division was probably more flexible at first, but over time it became a rigid hereditary structure that would shape social life for thousands of years. Compared with the more anonymous cities of the Harappan age, clear hierarchies and a spiritual interpretation of social order now came to the forefront. Technically and militarily, the Indo-Aryans brought the chariot with them, which was a decisive advantage in open landscapes and supported a form of warfare based on speed and mobility. Their culture was strongly shaped by the rhythm of nature. Seasons, river cycles, and agricultural rituals determined the calendar. Trade remained important, but the center of life shifted eastward into the fertile Ganges basin, where new kingdoms arose and competed with one another. In its early phase, Vedic culture was still a culture of the spoken word. No other people perfected the preservation of long texts word for word over centuries to the same degree. This ability created not only continuity in religion, but also an awareness of history and identity that remained deeply rooted in the collective memory. But history does not stand still. The princes of these new kingdoms began to consolidate their power, forge alliances, and subjugate their neighbors. Out of the fabric of ritual, belief, and rule emerged a political dynamic that would soon become visible in the form of powerful empires. We now enter the world of the Nandas and the Mauryas, realms that for the first time united large parts of the subcontinent under one authority and opened a new chapter in Indian history. As the Vedic kingdoms along the Ganges basin expanded, a new age began in which not only faith and ritual, but also power politics and military strength determined the fate of the subcontinent. Among these realms, the Nanda kingdom stood out, its center located in Pataliputra, present-day Patna. The Nanda kings ruled over a vast territory in northeastern India, controlled fertile agricultural lands, and possessed an army whose size ancient sources describe as reaching up to 200,000 soldiers, 20,000 horsemen, and 3,000 war elephants. Compared with the smaller principalities of the time, this was a power difficult to challenge. But size alone does not protect a realm from internal tension. The Nandas were known for their strict tax policies and centralized administration, which ensured prosperity but also fueled resentment in the provinces. In this climate, a man stepped onto the stage who would change the face of India forever: Chandragupta Maurya. Supported by his teacher and advisor Chanakya, a master of strategy and political intrigue, Chandragupta forged a plan to overthrow the mighty Nanda kingdom. Through carefully built alliances and military skill, he succeeded in capturing Pataliputra and ending the dynasty. The timing of this shift in power could hardly have been more favorable. In the northwest, the withdrawal of Alexander the Great had left behind a power vacuum in which Greek and Persian governors competed for influence. Chandragupta used the situation to incorporate these territories into his own empire as well. In doing so, he encountered Seleucus the First Nicator, one of Alexander's generals who had established a Hellenistic realm in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. Instead of a long war, the two rulers chose a peace treaty that brought territorial gains to Chandragupta and was sealed by a dynastic marriage alliance and the famous gift of 500 war elephants, a symbol of mutual respect and clever diplomacy. Under Chandragupta's rule, the Mauryan Empire developed into one of the first truly centralized great powers of South Asia. Roads connected the provinces, a unified tax system provided resources, and a network of officials and spies, described in detail in the Arthashastra, one of the oldest manuals of statecraft, ensured that the ruler's will reached even remote regions. Compared with the loose tribal groupings of the Vedic period, this was a radical step toward a structured and unified administration that laid the groundwork for later empires. But Chandragupta's true legacy was not only territorial size. It was the creation of a stable political order that would allow his son Bindusara, and above all his grandson Ashoka, to rise to historical significance on a global scale. The power base had been laid, the structures had been strengthened, and soon the empire would be shaped not only by conquest, but by a moral vision the world had scarcely seen before. When Chandragupta and his son Bindusara had consolidated the Mauryan state, Ashoka, the grandson of the empire's founder, ascended the throne around 268 BCE, a ruler with military ambition and political foresight. In the early years of his reign, he expanded the empire's borders and strengthened his authority through determined campaigns. The most notorious of these wars was the campaign against the kingdom of Kalinga on the east coast of present-day Odisha. Kalinga was not only a strategically important coastal state with flourishing trade connections, but was also known for its independence and military strength. The war, which took place around 261 BCE, became one of the bloodiest conflicts of ancient India. Contemporary and later sources speak of around 100,000 dead, countless wounded, and hundreds of thousands driven from their homes. For Ashoka, who won the victory, it was a triumph that felt at the same time like a defeat. The endless lines of prisoners, the burned villages, the suffering of the civilian population, all of this left a deep impression on a ruler who until then had regarded war as a legitimate means of expanding power. That moment became the turning point of his life. Ashoka turned to the teachings of the Buddha, not only as a personal faith but as a political and moral guiding principle. He vowed to wage no more wars of conquest, and from then on dedicated himself to Dharma, a principle that encompassed moral duty, compassion, justice, and respect for all life. To spread his message, he had mighty stone pillars and rock edicts erected throughout the empire. In these inscriptions, written in the languages and scripts of different regions, he proclaimed religious tolerance, care for his subjects, and the protection of both humans and animals. Ashoka's rule shaped not only the Indian subcontinent, but radiated far beyond it. He sent Buddhist missionaries to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and possibly even as far as Greece and Egypt. The idea that a powerful monarch would voluntarily renounce further expansion in order to promote peace and ethical principles was extraordinary in the ancient world. While rulers such as Alexander the Great or the Roman emperors saw greatness in conquest, Ashoka now defined it in the preservation of life and the building of a just order. Yet even an idealistically governed empire was not immune to the wear of time. After Ashoka's death, his successors lacked the strength and foresight necessary to preserve unity. Provinces broke away, regional rulers gained power, and the once stable Mauryan structure began to fall apart. Despite this decline, Ashoka's legacy remained alive in Buddhist monasteries, in the edicts that can still be read on pillars across India, and in the idea that power can be exercised not only through weapons, but also through wisdom. As we now turn our gaze away from the fading splendor of the Mauryas, the next part takes us deep into the south, to the Tamil kingdoms, whose trade routes, temples, and sea power wrote a very different chapter of Indian history. While Ashoka's legacy slowly faded in the north, and new powers competed for influence, a world flourished in the south of the subcontinent that developed its own language, culture, and political dynamic, the Tamil kingdoms. These realms, among them the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas, lay in a region marked by fertile coastal plains, dense forests, and strategically favorable ports. Even in antiquity they connected the land not only with the rest of India, but with the wide world beyond the sea. Trade was the beating heart of these kingdoms. Across the Indian Ocean, Tamil ships sailed to Sri Lanka, into the Bay of Bengal, on to Southeast Asia, and even to the Roman Empire. Roman gold coins found in Tamil Nadu testify to the exchange of goods such as pepper, pearls, gemstones, and fine textiles for wine, glass, and coins from the west. The port of Kavirpattinam was once a lively commercial metropolis, a hub in these maritime networks where merchants, pilgrims, and diplomats from different cultures encountered one another. But these kingdoms were distinguished not only by economic foresight, but also by a remarkable cultural heritage. The architecture of the Tamil kingdoms was marked by monumental stone temples that were not only places of worship but also centers of social and economic life. Especially the later Chola temples, such as the Brihadisvara temple in Thanjavur, still impress today with their harmonious symmetry, elaborate sculptures, and the sheer scale of their towering gateways. In the halls of these temples, not only religious ceremonies were held, but also performances of music and dance taught from generation to generation. The classical dance form Bharatanatyam, with its precise gestures and deeply spiritual themes, is rooted in this tradition and remains a living symbol of Tamil culture to this day. The temple was also an employer, a place of learning, and a storehouse of wealth, in many ways an institution fulfilling far more functions than the religious centers of the north. Politically, the three kingdoms were often rivals, fighting wars over trade routes and fertile land. These tensions prevented the lasting unification of the South, but they also created an atmosphere of competition that drove art, architecture, and trade forward. Compared with the often centrally governed empires of the North, the Tamil kingdoms remained more regionally rooted, but also more flexible in their alliances. In time, one of these kingdoms, the Chola Empire, would emerge from this competition and extend its power far beyond the south. It built one of the greatest fleets in Asia, secured trade routes as far as Indonesia, and carried Tamil culture to distant lands. There we arrive at the next great age, in which ships and temple towers alike became symbols of a realm that united commerce and spirituality in a unique way. While the Tamil kingdoms in the south cultivated their trade routes and temples, northern India experienced in the 4th and 5th centuries CE an era that historians would later describe as a golden age, the time of the Gupta Empire. Under rulers such as Chandragupta I, Samudragupta, and Chandragupta II, the empire stretched from the fertile plains of the Ganges to the coasts of the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. It was a period of relative political stability, economic prosperity, and cultural flowering that in retrospect is often compared with the classical age of Greece or the Pax Romana. The Gupta kings succeeded in creating an empire held together less by strict central power than by a network of vassals and alliances. This political flexibility allowed the regions to preserve their own character while trade and agriculture flourished. With prosperity came the patronage of art and science, and in the cities there arose centers of learning such as Nalanda, which became one of the most famous universities of the ancient world. In mathematics, scholars such as Aryabhata achieved breakthroughs, the use of zero as a number, the development of the decimal system, and precise calculations of pi. Astronomers recognized that the Earth rotates on its axis and described the movement of planets with an accuracy that Europe would not match until many centuries later. Knowledge also flourished in medicine. Physicians wrote detailed treatises on surgery, anatomy, and medicinal plants that spread far beyond India. The art of this epoch was characterized by idealized beauty and a delicate balance between realism and spirituality. In the Ajanta caves, wall paintings of rare expressive power were created, depicting scenes from the life of the Buddha as well as courtly festivities. Sculptures from this period show deities in harmonious proportions, with gentle features and an elegance that still moves the viewer today. In literature, the Gupta Empire produced masterpieces such as the dramas and poems of Kalidasa, whose works remain among the high points of Sanskrit literature. Compared with earlier empires such as the Mauryas, which were often defined by military conquest and strict administration, the Gupta Empire embodied a more subtle form of power, one based on cultural prestige, economic connectivity, and intellectual brilliance. Yet this flourishing age also had its limits. Dependence on regional rulers made the empire vulnerable to external attacks, and in the 6th century the invasions of the Hunas led to its gradual decline. Still, the intellectual and artistic wealth of this epoch left traces that endured far beyond its political end. Many scientific achievements of the Gupta period later entered Islamic and European scholarship and still shape our knowledge today. When we now turn our eyes away from the brilliance of this age, we enter a very different world, a time when sword and Quran shaped northern India, and the Delhi Sultanate created a new cultural synthesis that would change the subcontinent for centuries. Long after the Gupta Empire had become history, and the north of India was ruled by smaller kingdoms and regional princes, the gates opened to new powers from the northwest. Through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush came, in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the Ghaznavids, a dynasty of Turkic Mamluk origin whose center lay in what is now Afghanistan. Under their most famous ruler, Mahmud of Ghazni, they led repeated campaigns deep into the Indian subcontinent. Mahmud was a capable commander whose cavalry and tactical speed allowed him to reach distant targets, plunder rich temples, and carry immense booty back to his capital. His invasions had not only military but also cultural consequences. They marked the beginning of a lasting Islamic presence in northern India, even though the Ghaznavids themselves never established complete territorial rule there. In the 12th century they were succeeded by the Ghurids, whose commanders, above all Muhammad of Ghor, won decisive battles against Hindu princes and laid the foundation for a new and lasting power, the Delhi Sultanate. Founded in 1246, this state extended in its best periods over most of northern India. It was ruled by various dynasties, the Mamluks, Khaljis, Tughlaqs, Saids, and finally the Lodis, and each ruler brought his own reforms, ambitions, and conflicts. The Delhi Sultanate was more than a political entity. It was a melting pot in which Islamic, Persian, and Indian traditions mixed. In architecture, magnificent mosques and minarets arose, such as the Qutb Minar in Delhi, whose delicate stone carvings and inscriptions made the new cultural influence visible. At the same time, many aspects of local administration, language, and agriculture were preserved, creating a unique cultural synthesis. Militarily, the Sultanate faced enormous challenges. Mongol invasions in the 13th and 14th centuries repeatedly threatened its existence. Yet the rulers of Delhi, unlike many other empires in Eurasia, succeeded in repelling them. These successes strengthened the Sultanate's self-image as defender of its domains. Nevertheless, the empire remained fragile from within. Power struggles between factions, economic tensions, and repeated uprisings in the provinces weakened it again and again. Compared with earlier Indian empires such as the Mauryas or the Guptas, which were built on indigenous traditions, the Delhi Sultanate introduced a new religious and cultural dimension into the history of the subcontinent. It marked the beginning of an age in which Islamic scholarship, legal systems, and artistic forms existed alongside Hindu and Buddhist traditions, not always peacefully but often in fruitful interaction. By the end of the 15th century, however, clear cracks had appeared in the foundation. Regional powers were growing stronger, and in the northwest a new force appeared that would once again change the course of Indian history: the Mughals. But before they fully dominated the north, new chapters also opened in the south and along India's coasts, this time not through armies from the steppes, but through ships coming from distant Europe. In 1498, Vasco da Gama landed after a difficult voyage around the Cape of Good Hope in the port of Calicut on the Malabar coast. With him began an era in which the Indian Ocean became the stage of global trade and power politics. The Portuguese quickly recognized the immense value of India's trade goods. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, gemstones, cotton textiles, and indigo were luxury commodities highly sought after in Europe. Instead of merely fitting themselves into existing networks, they relied on a system of fortified trading posts, the so-called feitoриas, and secured them with cannons and warships. Goa was conquered in 1510 and soon developed into the capital of Portuguese Asia, from which a network of bases from Hormuz in the Persian Gulf to Malacca in Southeast Asia was controlled. The Portuguese presence was not only economic, but also cultural. They brought Christianity, European architecture, and new ship technologies, while carrying Indian spices, fabrics, and even culinary influences back to Europe. Unlike earlier conquerors on land, they used the sea as a strategic weapon. Whoever controlled the ports and sea lanes held the key to wealth. But the Portuguese lead did not remain unchallenged. Already in the 17th century, new competitors appeared: the Dutch East India Company with its center in Batavia, the Danes with smaller bases on the Coromandel coast, and finally the French and the British. While the Dutch remained largely focused on the Spice Islands, the British and the French saw in India a field in which not only trade but also territorial rule was possible. Indian powers responded differently to this maritime rivalry. Some, such as the powerful Vijayanagar Empire in the south, tried to form alliances with Europeans in order to play off rivals against each other. Others, especially smaller coastal principalities, fell into economic dependence or lost entire ports to the new sea powers. Compared with the land empires of the north, which relied mainly on cavalry and fortresses, the Europeans understood how to use their fleets as mobile fortresses, a concept that would permanently alter the political map of the subcontinent. Over time, two powers moved to the forefront: France and above all Great Britain, whose East India companies not only traded, but raised their own armies and intervened deeply in India's internal conflicts. Yet before the British Lion roared at full strength, another empire would reach the height of its splendor: the Mughals, whose architecture, administration, and art still count among the most impressive chapters of Indian history. Into Indian history stepped a man whose bloodlines reached both to Timur, the conqueror from Transoxiana, and to Genghis Khan, Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad Babur. With a comparatively small but disciplined army, he crossed the Indus, used innovative tactics with field artillery and muskets, and defeated the last ruler of the Delhi Sultanate at the First Battle of Panipat in 1526. This victory marked the beginning of the Mughal dynasty, which for almost 3 centuries would shape the political, cultural, and economic life of northern India. Babur himself was more than a warrior. In his memoirs, the Baburnama, he described landscapes, people, and customs with a sensitivity rarely found in conquerors. But only his grandson, Jalal-ud-Din Muhammad Akbar, would turn the empire into a true great power. Akbar, who ascended the throne in 1556 at the age of only 13, proved to be a visionary ruler. He abolished discriminatory taxes on non-Muslims, promoted dialogue between religions, and drew scholars of different faiths to his court. His administration reformed the tax system, standardized weights and measures, and thereby strengthened the economic foundation of the empire. Under Akbar's rule, the size of the Mughal Empire multiplied, and with its wealth grew its cultural radiance. art and architecture flourished. Cities such as Sikri still testify to a synthesis of Islamic, Persian, Central Asian, and Hindu elements. Miniature painting developed into a highly refined art form, and workshops produced manuscripts admired throughout Asia. After Akbar, his successors, among them Jahangir, continued the cultural course, even though political stability was increasingly threatened by court intrigue and succession wars. Jahangir was known for his love of naturalistic painting and for a subtle diplomacy that impressed even European envoys. But it was his son Shah Jahan who raised Mughal architecture into the realm of legend. Shah Jahan, whose name is inseparably linked with the Taj Mahal, had this marble symphony of love and grief built for his deceased wife Mumtaz Mahal. The monument, with its perfect symmetry, delicate inlay work, and harmonious proportions, is still regarded as one of the greatest masterpieces of world architecture. Yet Shah Jahan was not only a builder. He also consolidated the administration and infrastructure of the empire. He commissioned palaces, mosques, and gardens that reflected the brilliance of his rule. At the same time, however, the darker side grew. The enormously expensive courtly lifestyle, lavish construction projects, and military campaigns burdened the treasury. While the elite basked in splendor, many peasants suffered under high taxes. The contrast between the grandeur of the capital and the poverty of the rural population became an increasing strain. Thus the Mughal Empire under Shah Jahan stood at the height of its cultural and architectural power. But cracks had already appeared in its foundation. In the next stage of this journey we see how those weaknesses were exploited by rising forces such as the Marathas, while new European powers cast their nets over the subcontinent. When the Mughal Empire under Aurangzeb reached its greatest territorial extent, it seemed invincible. Yet precisely in this phase of overstretch, a force arose in the west of the subcontinent that would permanently alter the political balance: the Marathas, originally a community of peasant warriors and local princes. In the rugged hill country of present-day Maharashtra, they grew under the leadership of one man into a serious power, Shivaji Bhonsle. Shivaji skillfully exploited the topographical advantages of his homeland. Instead of open-field battles, he relied on guerrilla tactics, rapid cavalry attacks, and the targeted occupation of mountain fortresses that presented even experienced Mughal generals with major challenges. He succeeded not only militarily, but also in building a loyal administration in which local communities could play a role. With his coronation in 1674, he created a sovereign kingdom that not only stood up to the Mughals, but also cemented Maratha pride as an independent political force. After Shivaji's death, his successors, the Peshwas as hereditary prime ministers, continued the expansion. In the 18th century, Maratha influence extended over wide parts of northern and central India. Their ability to form alliances and strike militarily at the right moment made them key players in the complicated power struggle between the Mughals, regional sultanates, and the increasingly present European powers. Yet the Marathas differed from the centralized Mughals in one crucial point: their rule was a loose confederation of semi-autonomous principalities which, though under Peshwa supremacy, often pursued their own interests. This structure gave them flexibility, but also led to tensions and rivalries within the confederation. Parallel to this, the Europeans, above all the British and the French East India Companies, used the political fractures in the subcontinent to their advantage. They offered military support in exchange for trade privileges or territorial concessions and became entangled in local conflicts that served them as stepping stones to greater influence. In this complex web, the Marathas were sometimes allies and sometimes enemies of the European powers, depending on what suited their interests. Compared with the Mughals, who demonstrated power through monumental architecture and centralized rule, the Marathas relied on mobility, regional networking, and a balance between war and diplomacy. Yet their strength, too, had limits. The Third Battle of Panipat in 1761 against the Afghans under Ahmad Shah Durrani was a devastating setback that stopped their expansion and weakened them for the long term. This loss of power opened the door to a new phase in India's history, one in which traditional empires no longer set the tone, but trading companies with private armies and global ambitions. As the Mughal Empire was pulled into the whirlpool of internal conflict and the Marathas had clearly lost some of their striking power after Panipat, a power entered the scene that at first seemed like just another player in the trade game, the British East India Company. Founded in 1600 by royal charter, it began modestly as a trading company with the aim of bringing spices, textiles, and tea from Asia to Europe. Its first bases on the coasts of India, in Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, were at first mainly warehouses fortified against pirates and rival powers. But behind the scenes, the company possessed a feature that set it apart from other European merchants. It had the license to wage wars, conclude treaties, and govern territories. And it had the means to carry all this out. Over time, it built a private army consisting of British officers and tens of thousands of Indian soldiers, the so-called sepoys. Cannons, ships, and an efficiently organized supply system turned this force into a serious military power. The turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, when Robert Clive, with a comparatively small force, defeated the Nawab of Bengal, not least through skillful bribery and division within the enemy leadership. The victory brought the company not only control over Bengal, one of the richest regions of Asia, but also enormous revenues from taxes and trade. Thus the East India Company was transformed from a mercantile enterprise into a territorial ruler. In the decades that followed, it used every opportunity to expand its influence, whether through direct conquest, protective treaties with princely states, or exploitation of political crises. Compared with traditional empires, the company operated like a modern corporation, with clear cost-benefit calculation, a strict chain of command, and the goal of maximizing profit for its shareholders. But this form of rule came at a high price for the population. The company forced the cultivation of export crops such as indigo, cotton, and opium at the expense of food crops. In times of crop failure, this led to famines such as the devastating Bengal famine of 1770, in which millions perished. At the same time, the introduction of European administrative and legal systems brought deep social upheavals. Some saw modernization in this, others saw an attack on structures that had grown over centuries. Militarily, the company remained unmatched, even against European rivals such as the French, who failed in the Carnatic Wars. Indian powers such as the Sikhs or the last independent sultanates were either militarily defeated or driven into dependence by treaty. Yet the company's growing power and its interference in religious and cultural practices sowed the seeds of resentment that would soon erupt in a great uprising. By the middle of the 19th century, the power of the British East India Company seemed unshakable. It controlled large parts of the subcontinent, possessed a huge army of Indian soldiers, and supported its rule through a dense network of treaties with local princes. But beneath the surface, tensions were brewing. Economic exploitation, religious strains, and the feeling that British administration was intruding deeply into traditional ways of life had prepared the ground for discontent. The immediate spark that ignited the powder keg was the introduction of a new rifle, the Enfield rifle. The cartridges for it were sealed with grease thought to come from cattle and pigs, an affront both to Hindus, for whom the cow is sacred, and to Muslims, for whom pigs are unclean. Loading these cartridges required biting them open, and for many sepoys this was a direct attack on their faith. In May 1857, a mutiny began in Meerut and spread like wildfire. Soldiers laid down their arms, attacked British garrisons, and called for the restoration of Mughal rule under the aged Bahadur Shah II. The rebellion expanded into a popular uprising in which not only soldiers but also peasants, craftsmen, and dispossessed nobles took part. Cities such as Delhi, Kanpur and Lucknow became centers of bloody fighting. The British responded with massive military violence. Supported by princely states that remained loyal and by troops from other parts of the empire, they managed to crush the uprising by 1858. The fighting claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and the reprisals were often as brutal as the uprising itself. Compared with earlier conflicts, this was no limited war between states, but a sweeping revolt that changed forever the relationship between rulers and ruled. The result was a radical restructuring of the colonial order. The British East India Company was dissolved, and the British Crown took direct control of India, the beginning of the British Raj. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876. The new colonial administration promised reforms, greater consideration of local elites, and investment in infrastructure such as railways, telegraphs, and modern ports. At the same time, however, economic exploitation intensified. India was integrated even more strongly into the global trade system, above all as a supplier of raw materials and a market for British industrial goods. Politically, the Raj was a balancing act between modernization and control. While educational initiatives and new legal systems created an educated urban middle class, the British maintained strict security laws and a clear racial hierarchy. The memory of 1857 remained omnipresent, for the British as a warning, for many Indians as a symbol of resistance. But the Raj would not last forever. The social, economic, and political currents that emerged during its rule would eventually give rise to a movement that fought not with weapons, but with words, marches, and civil disobedience. At the beginning of the 20th century, British rule seemed firmly established. Railways crossed the country. British governors resided in magnificent buildings, and London regarded India as the jewel in the crown. Yet beneath this glittering surface, a national movement was growing that was no longer satisfied with limited reforms. In cities and villages, among students, workers, and peasants, the thought matured that India must become free, completely free. Into this atmosphere stepped Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Shaped by his experiences in South Africa, where he fought discrimination against Indians, he brought with him a new form of political resistance, satyagraha, nonviolent resistance based on truth, moral steadfastness, and the refusal to accept injustice. For Gandhi, violence was not only morally wrong, but also counterproductive. True freedom could be achieved only through means that were themselves free from oppression. His campaigns were aimed at undermining the foundations of colonial power. The non-cooperation movement of 1920 called on millions to boycott British schools, courts, and titles. The famous Salt March of 1930, in which Gandhi and his followers marched more than 380 kilometers to the sea in order symbolically to produce salt, posed a direct challenge to the British monopoly and made him known throughout the world. Compared with the uprisings of 1857 or the armed movements of later decades, this approach was new, and it showed that civil disobedience could mobilize a mass movement without ending in a bloodbath. Gandhi, however, was not alone. Leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhas Chandra Bose, and Vallabhbhai Patel brought their own visions and methods into the independence movement. While Bose relied on military means and even cooperated with the Axis powers during the Second World War, Gandhi held unwaveringly to non-violence. This variety of approaches showed the breadth of Indian nationalism, but also the tensions within the movement. The Second World War intensified the situation. Indian resources and soldiers were used on a massive scale for the British war effort, often without prior consultation with Indian leaders. Millions of Indians served on fronts in Europe, Africa, and Asia, while at home food shortages and economic hardship grew. The Bengal famine of 1943, in which millions died, intensified the outrage over colonial policy. In 1942, the Indian National Congress launched the Quit India movement, a clear demand that the British leave the country immediately. The response was harsh. Tens of thousands were arrested, including almost the entire Congress leadership. But the pressure grew, both from within the country and from the international stage, where the post-war order increasingly called colonialism into question. Finally, in 1947, the time had come. India gained its independence, but the joy was overshadowed by the painful reality of partition. British India was divided into two states, India and Pakistan, a decision accompanied by violence, flight, and deep scars. As India entered independence on 15 August 1947, a new chapter began for the country, one no less challenging than the centuries before. Partition had left deep wounds. Millions of people were on the move, entire regions traumatized by violence. And yet India chose not the path of dictatorship or military rule, as was common in many young states of that era, but the path of democracy in a country as diverse as almost no other. With the Constitution of 1950, India became the largest democracy in the world. Today, more than 1 billion people have the right to vote, and despite all challenges, free and fair elections take place regularly. This political system has remained remarkably stable when one considers that India encompasses more than 2,000 ethnic groups, hundreds of languages, and numerous religions. Compared with many other post-colonial states, this continuity is an extraordinary success, even if it is accompanied by conflicts, regional tensions, and bureaucratic obstacles. Economically, the path was less straightforward. After a phase of socialist planned economy in the first decades, India turned in the 1990s toward economic liberalization. Today it is among the fastest-growing economies in the world. Metropolises such as Mumbai, Bengaluru, and Hyderabad are centers of IT, film, commerce, and research. At the same time, the contrast between rapid growth and persistent poverty remains visible. High-tech parks and skyscrapers often stand only a few kilometers away from villages where agriculture is still practiced with traditional methods. India is also playing an increasingly important role in science and technology. The Indian Space Research Organization (ISRO) has successfully carried out missions to the Moon and Mars and has positioned itself as a cost-efficient player in the global space market. In fields such as pharmaceuticals, renewable energy, and digital services, the country has also gained international importance. Bollywood, and increasingly streaming productions as well, brings Indian stories to the whole world and adds to the country's cultural influence. Yet India also faces enormous challenges. Population growth, environmental problems such as air pollution and water scarcity, social inequality, and religious tensions are all putting democracy to the test. The balance between economic progress and sustainable development will be decisive in the coming decades. On the global stage, India appears confident today. As a member of the G20, BRICS, and other international forums, it seeks balance between the major power blocs and positions itself as a voice of the global South. This role has historical depth. After all, India was for millennia a crossroads between cultures, markets, and ideas. When we look back on this long journey, from the first cities on the Indus to satellites in space, it becomes clear that India's history is not a straight road, but a web of rise, decline, adaptation, and renewal. And perhaps that is precisely the secret of its strength, the ability to reinvent itself again and again without forgetting its own roots. Thus we close the circle that we began in the mists of prehistory and leave open the question of which chapters India will write in the future. When we now let our gaze sweep once more across this immense span of time, from the quiet streets of the Harappan cities in which life pulsed thousands of years ago, across the mighty empires of the Mauryas and Guptas, the splendor of the Mughal courts, the stormy age of colonial rule, and finally to an independent modern India, we may perhaps feel that history is not made only of dates and rulers. It lives in the stories of the people who lived, hoped, fought, and loved. India has shown that true greatness lies not only in conquest or wealth, but in the ability to rise from crises, to draw strength from diversity, and to preserve values such as compassion, tolerance, and curiosity. It is a story of change, but also of continuity, and in it something is reflected that reaches far beyond borders: the human will to shape a future built on the lessons of the past. Perhaps you will take away from this journey through India's history not only facts, but also inspiration for your own life story, for understanding other cultures,